we've got all kinds of little things happening. So I just changed over from our last crew, and that was with Jeffrey Guntz of the lidblog.com. And now it's so great, no sound bites allowed. So it's great to be here. And as you can see on the screen, I have my guest with me. He is with the Frederick Douglass Leadership Institute. My brain is fried. My eyes are gone. I don't know where my glasses are. So please, folks, please bear with me. It's my fault if I get something wrong here. I have to be honest, it's been very exciting. Did you, first of all, let's introduce you properly. You are, I'm sorry.
No problem. Dean. Reverend Dean Nelson.
Reverend Dean.
Yes, sir.
I remember it was Reverend Nelson, but I forgot your first name.
No problem, man. No problem.
And Reverend Nelson, did you get to see Vice President Pence today when he was speaking this morning?
This morning, I did not, although I did organize a meeting for him just yesterday at Frederick Douglass's home here in Washington, D.C., and was with him actually this time last week. So I've connected with him and do work with his office often, but I did not hear him this morning, although I heard it was phenomenal.
He did a great job, and I really did enjoy that. And we had a great time. By the way, for people who are not catching this with my podcast live, you can also see it on the Exceptional Conservative Network or the exceptionalconservativeshow.com. Please check it out. Scroll down. You'll see us big on the screen there, as you can see. And you'll also see us on my program. So, Reverend Nelson, it's good to hear that you've been in touch with Mike Pence and you've been able to speak with him a couple of times. And what do you think of the Vice President? We hear a lot about him, but what did you think?
It's a great question. Yeah, I have known the Vice President actually for over a decade. When he was first here in Washington, D.C. as a congressman, I got to know him. He was the only congressman that hosted every year a specific event for African-American pro-life leaders. And that's how I got to know him, as a person of faith, somebody who stood up for the sanctity of human life. And I've had friends that have worked for him since then, even since he's been here in Washington, D.C. I think that he's an exceptional statesman, and I think that he is a unique and very different balance to our president.
Yes. And our president, he needs someone who's, as much as I love the directness of President Trump, it's also important to have someone who's a little more polished in terms of being more of a diplomat sometimes.
It's a little bit more my flow, but you're right. I mean, Washington is a unique place, and sometimes you do need an outsider that comes and kind of shakes things up, but it's great to have someone who has the knowledge of how things work, in Congress, somebody who has the trust and the commitment from people that work on that side to help to get things done, to push that agenda through.
Absolutely, and I think it's part of the influence of having a good business strategy. Mm-hmm. You've got a very strong, maybe somewhat forceful leader, and then you also have that second in command who can, now that you've done the shock, here comes the awe. That's another way to look at it. I like to think of it that way. Nancy Pelosi gets a little shock with the president, and then here comes Vice President Pence to come on by and do the awe. But I bring that up to bring into context some of the work that you're doing with the Frederick Douglass Institute.
Yes.
Because I'm sure a lot of people may not have heard about that.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. So I'm the chairman of both the Frederick Douglass Foundation, which is more of our partisan political group, and the Douglass Leadership Institute, which is our nonpartisan nonprofit. They basically exist, we say, to promote liberty, justice. We have three primary initiatives, which are criminal justice reform, strengthening the black family, and economic opportunity. And as of late, we've been working in coalition with another organization that I serve with. That's Human Coalition, which is one of the largest pro-life organizations in the country. And we provide free services for women who find themselves in an unplanned pregnancy. And so last week, the two organizations came together along with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Virginia and, of all organizations, the NAACP of Virginia, to do two things: to denounce racism and infanticide. We did what was called a March on the Mansion, and calling for Governor Ralph Northam to resign because not just of his
The blackface.
blackface, but also because of his statements that amounted to infanticide. We feel like that those two things strike at the core of human dignity, and that's something that Frederick Douglass, who was the most photographed person of the 19th century, stood for. People who don't know, but if you've ever seen a picture of Frederick Douglass, it's always a picture of him in a suit, a tie, and very dignified, because he was countering the blackface type of image that was being pushed, the stereotypical image of black men. And so for those reasons, we marched on the mansion, had hundreds of people to come and denounce both, again, racism and infanticide.
Well, I know the infanticide, in New York State, we had a similar law that just passed. You may not be familiar, I'm from upstate New York.
Yep.
And we came down to CPAC to talk to people just about some of these issues. You may not be familiar with the bill. In New York, we have abortion up to the moment of birth.
Yes.
Which is insane and inflamed most of the state, that they've gone so far with this movement for abortion. I mean, as I've heard from almost every doctor, maybe you know better, that once you hit the third trimester, there's no reason not to birth that child. There's really no, maybe a few extreme situations, but otherwise the child can be born.
Right.
And why shouldn't we do that rather than to abort for some of the least credible reasons? Not to take someone's choice away, but it just seems, as you said,
no one really should possess that choice, right?
Yeah.
To take the life of an innocent human being that's fully developed, that is past the age of viability. That's why I think it was shocking to most Virginians, because it was a very similar piece of legislation that they're now dubbing the birthday abortion bill. Essentially, you can be aborted on the day of your birth. And I feel like that for someone like Ralph Northam, who is a pediatric surgeon, who knows better. I mean, you made a commitment long time ago to do no harm. Then when you also swore to uphold the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia, you made, in effect, a commitment to protect and to serve. And as I stated there at the mansion, it seems that Ralph Northam is more concerned about defending blackface than about protecting black babies.
I think it's been incredible, and I think the whole blackface thing took away from the very real argument that a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans here at CPAC and all across the nation are very concerned about this. I mean, there's a lot of passion, especially when we're talking about the most innocent people. What is more innocent than not only a baby, but a baby being birthed?
Absolutely. And, and I understand, people have, different thoughts with regard to, the subject of abortion, particularly before the age of viability. But in each of these cases, this is like fully developed. The vast majority of Americans, independent, Republican, and Democrats, feel that late-term abortions should not be acceptable within our culture. And so at Human Coalition, we try really hard on the front end to provide free services to women who find themselves in an unplanned pregnancy. So when we reach out to them, they call our contact center. We're communicating with that woman, trying to find out what are her needs. Roughly 80% of women say that they get an abortion because they think that they have no other options. Well, we're trying to provide a host of options so that she makes that healthy choice for herself and her unborn child.
Now, to play a little devil's advocate,
Sure.
Because I know some of the listeners may have heard a lot from Planned Parenthood. Obviously, they're one of the biggest voices. I think it's 300,000 abortions a year, as I recall. And if I remember correctly, it's approximately 125,000 of them or more are black children.
35%.
Please don't. I'm usually exact on my numbers, folks, and I know you're double checking me there, but I believe that's, if not exact, it's very close. And so somebody would say, how does what you're doing compare to the things that we hear supposedly Planned Parenthood is doing, although they're not really known for anything except the abortion, because they don't really have facilities to do anything except that. So what makes you different?
Yeah, well, first I'd like to remind those that are listening to you that the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, was the one connecting with those ministers in New York who said that we don't want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. She would go on to say that the minister is the one who could straighten out the more rebellious members if it should ever occur to them. So yeah, I mean, they pretend as if they're there to help. They pretend that they're quote unquote pro-choice, but they're really not pro-choice. There are $1 billion nonprofit with $1 billion of assets, and their whole focus is how they can engage primarily with young women to get them to pay their $500 to $3,000 or whatever that number is, depending upon how late term the abortion. It is a money-making industry that preys on the weak and the vulnerable. What we do through our women's clinics throughout the country is simply to engage with those women and to provide them with a host of different services. And even the women that come into our centers that say, you don't understand, I have to go through with this, 97% of them, even if they go on to get the abortion, say that they would refer us to a friend because of the way that they were treated, with kindness, with dignity, again, providing them a host of services to make a healthy decision for their preborn child.
I think that's one of the most important things in the process, no matter where you wind up exactly, to know that you have dignity and that you have respect going through a very difficult decision. I've talked to many women. It's a very difficult decision to make, and many will regret it all their lives, depending on what choice they've made. So I really am glad to hear that you do have that concern, and that is foremost, because we don't see that in the Planned Parenthoods out there.
Not at all.
And I should mention to people, I know James O'Keefe was speaking earlier today. He did one of the big exposés, the big startling news about how the people, and I know it's a little graphic for some folks, so I'm sorry, but it is news, and they did find that the babies are sold for parts. And that's another profit motive out of the Planned Parenthood approach,
without a doubt,
to family planning that isn't necessarily family planning.
Look, I mean, from the beginning to the end, Planned Parenthood on the front end gets a third of their revenues from government, whether it is through Title X or whether it is through Medicaid reimbursement. So, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that they get on the front end. Then, of course, through their business model, they make women pay for the abortions. And then on top of that, as you've explained, they then sell the baby body parts to make money. It is a heinous, horrible industry, again, that seeks to prey on vulnerable women particularly. And I think that it is important for those of us of faith and conscience to be able to speak very clearly to that issue. And let's not forget, most of their surgical abortion facilities are found in Black and Latino neighborhoods. It was a study that was done by an organization protecting Black life that you can visit, and they will literally show you where each of their surgical abortion facilities are found. You can literally view it through a camera on Google. So for Planned Parenthood to suggest a few years ago that only 9% of their facilities were in minority neighborhoods, if you live in the hood, you know that they are there.
You know they're there. And I've seen studies done before that that emphasize the fact that they are primarily in urban locations,
exactly right.
High density of minorities in those areas. So,
and if I could add, they have over the last 5 to 10 years been closing down their other facilities. So like in Pennsylvania, the Gettysburg facility was closed, the Scranton facility was closed, but where are they opening their brand new ones? When we were there in Richmond, Virginia, protesting the governor, we learned that Planned Parenthood's newest large surgical facility is being put right in the hood in Richmond, Virginia.
Really? See, that's the thing that's not getting out there and is not being discussed. Let me ask another question. I know many people would ask about this. So I want to be fair, because we brought up the question about the government funding for Planned Parenthood. And
Yes.
I know President Trump has been forcefully trying to shut down. I know many of the conservatives here at CPAC also support that. And I take it, and I don't want to put words in your mouth,
Sure.
I believe that you would also support stopping that funding. But let me ask you this. For your organization,
Yes.
do you receive funding from the government, or is it just all, because it is a nonprofit, is it all just donation based, or how does that work?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So Human Coalition is not yet 10 years old, and for the vast majority of our time, it's always been private funding. But when we recognize that for us to expand our model, and we look at Planned Parenthood receiving funding 2 years ago, we decided, well, we should at least compete for those dollars, because we're providing the services, in many cases doing it better and more efficiently. And so over the last year and a half, we have actually gotten contracts from the state of North Carolina, contracts from the state of Georgia, and a large contract from the state of Texas. But the thing that I think is important for us to highlight, we are a metric-driven, data-focused nonprofit, and we show our numbers. And so as a result, those states have said, you're doing this better than any other entity that we've worked with. We want to expand that work. And so in honesty, yeah, we have begun to engage to receive state dollars. Look, it's nothing, it's not even 1% of what Planned Parenthood gets, but we do feel like that it is important for us. Think of it this way. Even though abortion is quote unquote legal, there's nothing that says that dollars cannot be used to save the lives of children.
Right.
We spend millions of dollars for firefighters, for law enforcement, to what? Protect our citizens.
Yes.
And we're saying, is there anything wrong with having some kind of a system that at least exists to protect the most vulnerable within our culture?
No, I can understand that. And who can say that's not fair? You're talking about evening the playing field. If we have a Planned Parenthood, why don't we have an alternative?
That's exactly
or
right.
something that can supplement people in making their decisions out there. So even from the far left, they should recognize this is a matter of having equity. What do they always love to say?
That's right.
Equity. That's like the big buzzword for the progressives and the democratic socialists.
Yes.
Equity. Well, here it is. This is equity.
Yes.
So, but I did want to make sure people are aware of it, because we want to be fair, and also to deflate their argument, because if we didn't answer it, they'd go, you should have asked that.
That's right.
Let me ask you, and when people want to learn more about this, obviously, especially in Virginia, we've been doing a lot of work. Where are people able to go to find out more research, and more importantly, to find out where they can ask questions and get a dignified answer?
Mm-hmm. So we would encourage them certainly to visit our website, which is humancoalition.org, humancoalition.org. And when you go there, there's so many resources. You can actually find scores of videos that help communicate a difficult issue in a winsome way. I feel like that we want to empower and arm our activists and others to communicate in a winsome way why we should make abortion unthinkable within our culture. There are also information that they can get on Human Coalition University, where we'll be providing information on how people can learn kind of a pro-life apologetics to defend the right for innocent children with preborn children to be protected. So that would be the best place to go, particularly the videos. We do a podcast with our president every month, sometimes twice a month. So there are a lot of resources they can find there. And they can also look us up on our Facebook page as well as our Twitter. We have over, I think, 1 million people that liked us on Facebook because they see we're not about condemning any group of people. We're about celebrating life and finding ways that we can provide women with the needed resources and alternatives to actually ending the life of their preborn child.
And that's always an important thing. Do you have connections from when women come to you, and some of them may be in economically challenged times in their life? Is that also part of the process that you go through with them?
Without a doubt. We have what we call a continuum of care program, where when a woman comes in, she recognizes that she has needs. And so each one of our women's clinic has essentially a trained social worker that will help her to identify the resources that she needs. So if she comes in and she needs a job, so then we will refer her or help her to go to a job bank. If she needs skills, we will help her with preparing a resume, certain skills that she might need. If she needs immediate financial assistance, we'll connect her with sometimes private agencies, nonprofit agencies, or federal agencies or state agencies. We provide ourselves vitamins, things that she might need to make sure that, prenatal vitamins and things like that she needs to make sure that she can carry her child to term. And then we ultimately connect her with a community, whether that's a nonprofit community, whether that's with a church, so that she now has kind of a sustainable family around her that can help her should she fall into these difficult times again.
See, and I find it interesting because when you talk to some of these, especially on the far left, you don't hear a comprehensive plan.
Yeah.
You hear this is your only option. The answer is just an abortion, not, and we have to address all of the needs of their neighborhood. If we can help them with other parts of their life, other aspects that lift them up, and obviously give that dignity, why shouldn't we? So I find it very interesting, and I'm very happy to hear that you are looking at all of those aspects together.
Absolutely.
Let's take a moment, though. Obviously, we're here at CPAC, and I want to ask you, we've had Senator Cruz here today. We've had Candace Owens here. Charles Kirk is here. James O'Keefe is here today at CPAC. And they've all been speaking, obviously, as you mentioned, and you've spoken to Vice President Pence. How are you being received? How is the message coming across here?
Man, I think when anyone hears the life and the legacy and the message of Frederick Douglass, everybody stands and applauds. I mean, it's been, for the last couple of years up till now, it's been very positively received. President Trump actually appointed me and a handful of others to be on the federal commission for the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass. And all I need to do is to remind people about some of the quotes from Douglass. One of those, he said that, a man's rights are secured in 3 boxes: the jury box, the ballot box, and the cartridge box. So those Second Amendment folks love to hear that same message from Frederick Douglass. But similarly, people need to know, and we've received this message well. Just 2 nights ago, the Republican Party hosts an annual Trailblazers Award. Great, diverse group of people. I was proud to be there. Didn't know until just the day before. I was honored with their annual Trailblazers Award. And so our message is being received well, but it's not just by conservatives. The event that we did there at the March on the Mansion was with the NAACP and the SCLC because we found commonality. So our goal is to use the message and the principles of the conservative movement, articulate them through the voice of Frederick Douglass, and engage with diverse communities, because in reality, most of the people in the African American community, many people in the Latino community, at their core, they're conservative. But we have to find unique messengers that are able to communicate those truths in relevant ways so that we can engage those people and to have them a part of our growing farm team.
We're a little bit short. We've got about 7 minutes or so. And so let me take that time and let me ask you. We've talked about the Institute. We've talked about some projects. I do want to ask about the effort to get rid of Northam.
Yes.
Because I think that's important as well. But I also want to take a moment to just say, who's Reverend Nelson? Because, at the end of the day, everything is as good as the people who are behind it. Who are you?
Well, appreciate that, man. I was raised in Virginia, and that's why this issue with Governor Northam was important to me. I grew up in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I went to the University of Virginia. And so when I was a student, I saw often white party guys that were dressed in blackface every semester on campus. So my point simply is that it was part of the culture. Both my parents grew up in segregated Virginia. The town that I grew up in Fauquier County, Virginia, there was still in the 1980s a restaurant that black people could not go into.
In the 1980s?
In 1982, Roy McCoy's restaurant would not allow blacks to go into the restaurant. And so, and who would want to go into a place where you thought that the food, something might happen to the food, right?
Yeah.
So, I grew up, in a relatively small town, outside of, Washington, D.C. Both my parents, in my household, traditional values. My grandfather was one of those guys who was the more rebellious members that was talked about by Margaret Sanger. Bought 70 some acres of land when I was before I was born. Raised a farm. Grew up. I wondered why my granddad had guns in the house all the time. I never saw him hunt very much, but it was taught to me earlier that being raised in rural Virginia in that time period didn't mean that the quote-unquote law was on his side. So he had to protect himself, his family, and his property.
Which we've heard so much of. And, I mean, whether you're looking at Dr. Martin Luther King, you're looking at Malcolm X, you're looking at a lot of the leaders, Marcus Garvey, even in the past,
Yes.
where they've said part of us looking, and this is true for anyone.
Yeah.
I'm just using their names because everyone looks to names sometimes.
Yes.
But one of the key things for everyone's freedom, for able to get past these divisions we sometimes see, is to know that, well, we can defend ourselves. We're not pushovers. You're not just going to roll over us.
That's right.
We can defend ourselves, and that's part of our dignity, is that we can defend ourselves.
That's exactly right.
And I think that's an important message for a lot of people to hear as well.
Without a doubt. And that was a message that was reinforced. And I'm glad you brought that up, because my grandfather, my grandmother, my dad, and my mom, growing up in a segregated, Virginia, my grandfather never went to restaurants because they prevented him from going to restaurants. But this is the astounding thing. I never, ever, even in private conversation, heard my grandparents say a negative thing about a white person. Never. I mean, even though they were treated differently, even though there was segregation, they taught us that we had to have a different standard, a different spirit, if you will, because we were raised as Christians. We were taught that Jesus was our example and that we needed to exemplify something different. And that was the same story of Frederick Douglass. Even though he was born into slavery, even though he would escape into freedom, yet he still had a commitment to biblical principle and would go to his slave owner before he died and tell him that you're forgiven, and released him from anything that he had, which to me is so important in this day and age. Everybody wants to demand rights and to lift yourself up by putting someone else down. But that message of forgiveness, that message of understanding, I think is important. And I'll remind us of this. Dr. King said it this way with regard to the church. He said the church must be reminded that it is not the master nor the servant of the state, but rather it's called to be the conscience of the state. And if the church doesn't recapture its prophetic zeal, it becomes an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. I believe that the church, kind of as the church goes, so goes the nation. And if we need to recapture that prophetic zeal, or else we will, as a nation and as a people, become an irrelevant social club. And so my hope is that we'll engage more people along the lines of the values of Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr. to see our nation restored back to a place of dignity and of righteousness, and a place that's a blessing for all people.
You are a very forgiving man. I'm not as much. But then again, that's why I'm not a reverend. And those who know me would say, absolutely not. But you mentioned something about Frederick Douglass I think is very important in talking about Northam now.
Yes.
That Frederick Douglass went to his slave owner and said to him, I can forgive you. And what I've noticed that we haven't heard, and like you've heard from many of and I know folks, you're hearing a lot of background noise right now. It's CPAC. We have a lot of things going on.
That's the way it is. That's right.
But what we've seen with Northam, and we see this with a lot of the progressives in my area, it's Citizen Action or Black Lives Matters, the Antifas of the world, and here again with Northam, that they're demanding that we accept his statement on this, but not his request for forgiveness on this. Now, I am not from Virginia, but I have not heard about that. I've heard him say, well, he did something that he said, well, he read Roots. if that is correct, and I heard about it on the way down here, I did not get to check and confirm it.
Sure.
But that was his answer to, why I should be forgiven. I don't think it's a request for it, but let me ask you, since you're far more knowledgeable about this,
Sure.
has he asked for forgiveness, or is that root story correct?
I'm not certain about the root story, but I do know he has talked about forgiveness, but it wasn't in a very plain, clear way. I think when you have made statements and done what he's done, and even it came up yesterday that unfortunately his wife probably made a misstep by offering cotton to young kids and asking them to imagine themselves as slaves. So that being put aside, I think that for us and those of us who are citizens in Virginia, it's incumbent upon us to forgive him. But that's different than our civil disobedience, our call for him to step down because of his actions. So point is that I believe that he can ask for forgiveness, but that doesn't mean that you should want your position. It seems to me that he's more concerned about preserving his position rather than seeking for forgiveness.
Absolutely. And folks, again, we apologize. There's a little bit of a spectacle going on behind us. Some people are roaming and gathering attention as they go. But more importantly, they were able to hear you. And you came in a little closer to the camera, but more importantly, we were able to be heard. And I think it's a message that's very important. I do want to thank you for the time that we've had here today. And I know we started a little bit late. It's just the nature of CPAC.
Yes.
But I thank you for this. I want to get back in touch with you in a month or two, follow up. Let's see what we can do about Northam.
Yes.
Find out more about what's going on with the Institute, what's going on with the attempt to give people a choice when it comes to times of questioning in their lives. So I do want to follow that up. But I wanted to say again, I thank you, Reverend Nelson, for the time that you've given us here today. I hope you're going to get a lot more attention. I know you've already gotten a lot of attention today, but hopefully you'll continue to have that throughout all of CPAC. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you again very soon.
Amen. Thank you so much. And if people want to find out more about the Douglass Leadership Institute, it's dlinstitute.org. That's dlinstitute.org. They can also find us on Facebook and Twitter.
And I forgot about to ask that. They threw me off in the background, so it threw me off. But thank you for including that.
Bless you, man. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Have a good one.